Welcome to the STARS program, seniors taking active roles in society. And now, here's your host, Anita Finley.
Good morning, everyone. Well, it's Saturday. It's the last Saturday in May. And we have a very interesting show for you today. And actually, it starts off with George Freshman's book. And the book is called From Misery to Happiness, The Life of a Holocaust Survivor. And I will probably be reading from the book for you because you'll see why George Freshman just can't get on the radio to talk about this. But it's a wonderful book, and I think you'll enjoy that. Let me start this. What I think I will do is, since we reviewed the book as a publisher's choice, I'm going to read the review to you, and then I'm going to get into the book. We know that so many people living in South Florida have experienced the Holocaust. Their families have experienced living with someone who has experienced the Holocaust. So this may be very near and dear to your heart. And even if you didn't have anyone, as I've really not had anyone in my life, it's still extremely important. So let's just read, and then we'll read from his book. But this is from the review. The book again is called From Misery to Happiness, The Life of a Holocaust Survivor. It starts off, 19-year-old George Freshman, and his photo's on the cover of the book, and you'll be able to see that if you're reading Boomer Times. It was taken by an American soldier a few weeks after liberation on April 29th, 1945. And you can see this little man in one of those horrible, I would call it a uniform that the Nazis put on people. Anyway, it's impossible for all of us who did not experience what George and millions of others went through to even imagine what agony and horror occurred in those concentration camps. He was only 13 years old when he faced the horror of the Nazi regime in 1939 in his home in Poland. We have seen pictures, movies, read books, and heard from survivors about the terror, incredible cruelty, and inhumanity that faced the Jewish people during World War II. But George's story, although very similar to others, inspired me because he had and has such a positive attitude about life. He always had a dream that he would one day live a happy and normal life. Of course, George can and will never forget half of his life. Growing up in Poland, he explained what his life was like as the Nazis started to round up Jews. Once the Nazis began their torturing and placing people in ghettos, his life as he knew it drastically changed. So in his book, From Misery to Happiness, George shares his daily life in the camps, describing each and every gory detail. The Nazis made examples of young men to scare others into obeying. The descriptions of the torturous life George lived through cannot be believed if he were not here to tell it. That is why so many Holocaust museums have been built all over the world, so no one could ever deny what happened. Otherwise, it would just be a fable about monsters. It was no fable. I feel so proud of George Freshman and others who have pushed hard to make another life, having families, businesses, contributing to the United States society, and to be so appreciative of what freedom means. In his book, From Misery to Happiness, we see someone who had to learn a new language, had to earn money, but he was very social, so making friends and finding a wife was easier than for most. Although his first wife and he divorced, he was always a caring man and found the love of his life, Malka. They're being together over 45 years. They have traveled all over the world, even visiting the sites of Auschwitz and Dachau, but never finding his immediate family, whom he assumed were the victims of the camps. He says he remembers the past, but doesn't live in the past. At the end of the book, we can learn from George Freshman's philosophy. Though I have suffered many hardships in my life, I refuse to be a prisoner of past tragedies. I do not carry hate in my heart and have forgiven every person who has ever hurt me. Most importantly, I consider myself a very lucky and happy man. Although his book is very sad, it is also important to know what can happen if we have prejudices for those who have different religions and cultures. Every young person should especially read it. A little bit about the author. So George and Malka Freshman live in Hallandale Beach, Florida. They have 2 grown children, Florie and Lee. And if you want to purchase this book, From Misery to Happiness, The Life of a Holocaust Survivor, you can go to Amazon.com. And that's a place that, of course, you can get a lot of books, but it's called From Misery to Happiness. George, as I said before, we always have our authors on the show, but George just couldn't make it. He lives in Hallandale, but he said, I just can't talk about it. Would you talk about it for me? And, of course, that's what I'm doing now. I'm going to take a little bit from different pieces of this. One thing that is interesting is that George's name, Freshman, is not really spelled like freshman. It is now because it's been Americanized, but and I'll read that to you at some point, how it's spelled. But anyway, let me get through this. So, the dedication's always important in a book. And I was hesitant to write this book because the process of recollecting the events of my life that transpired under Nazi rule from September 1st, 1939 to April 29th, 1945, made for a difficult and painful journey. Ultimately, I am grateful for the opportunity to share my experiences and leave them for generations to come. I dedicate this book to my dear wife, Malka, who has supported me through the entire process. Also to my loving daughters, Lee and Florie, son-in-law Steve, sister-in-law Inga, Malka's sisters, Esther and Marina, her brother George, and to all our nieces and nephews and good friends. And the book is very, very powerful. It's a small book. And when I first saw it, I thought, well, am I really going to review this book? But I was so taken with it. So it's about 100 pages. And the nice thing is there are a lot of photographs in here of his family, of when they went back to Poland to visit, some beautiful tokens of his love for Malka. And, of course, when he did take pictures when they were in Auschwitz, I hate to even look at those. But, I mean, it doesn't show anything bad. It just shows it's all, of course, stands there in memory because it's important for people to do that. But I really was very, very impressed with what he did. And so, here I go. I'm going, and remember, this is from him. This is his book. And I'm going to get through a little bit of it. Of course, I can't read his whole book to you. But let me just read some things. And he said that, and the interesting thing is, as most people, and you've read a lot of things, you've seen movies, they couldn't believe that the Germans were going to come and do anything bad with them. They rounded them up, they put them in ghettos, and that was one of the problems that he had. He just couldn't believe that was happening because he went to the Polish school. But this is what he says. I watched through the window of our front room as one of the first German tanks rolled through Grochek, heading in the direction of Warsaw. Just as it was clearing the square, Polish artillery soldiers engaged, taking out the armored vehicle and its driver. It was September 1st, 1939. Although the Polish armed forces thwarted Germany's initial attempts, they would ultimately be unable to keep the Nazis from invading. The Reich's forces were simply too great in number and employed far more sophisticated weapons and strategies. So on September the 17th, the Red Army moved into eastern Poland, further hampering Polish efforts to keep the occupying forces at bay. Initially, believing the Soviets had come in to fight the Germans on their behalf, the Poles put up little resistance. By the time Polish officials realized that the Soviets had invaded to secure their own interests in Poland, it was too late. By early October, Polish armed forces had faltered, no longer strong enough to fight the deluge of ground troops, aerial strikes, and U-boat attacks in the Baltic Sea. Now, I'm just going to kind of flip through this a little bit to tell you, how things just moved along. The mood shifted dramatically, however, with the later arrival of the SS, who wasted no time in showing us the exact nature of their intentions. The SS officers organized groups of Jewish men, my father among them, to perform forced labor, mostly road and sewage maintenance. This sparked regular beatings of Jews by the Nazis and their Polish collaborators. Whether the Poles involved were true believers in the Nazi regime or felt compelled to go along for fear of being seen as Jewish sympathizers is hard to say. In either case, the Germans were undoubtedly aware of the hostility many Poles felt toward their Jewish neighbors and seized every opportunity to take advantage of the situation. A few weeks into the occupation, my father came home from a long day of work, badly beaten and bruised. His arm was black and blue from shoulder to wrist, marking injuries from which he would never fully recover. The ruthlessness of the Nazi regime had touched our family personally, spurring a profound sense of fear and helplessness. No longer able to shield his family from the grim reality that lay before us, my father became desperate to protect his children in any way he could. Some of our Jewish friends and neighbors have been able to flee to the Soviet Union, and it was my father's hope that we too could follow suit. But we lacked the means. With my father's encouragement, my brother Abe set out for the Soviet border in mid-September. Shortly thereafter, my father arranged for my sister Rivka to marry Herschel, a young, hard-working Jewish man my father felt would be a good provider and who would protect his daughter from the German soldiers. Then it goes on. What happens, though, a lot of these ideas do not come to pass. So, not 2 weeks later, Rivka and Herschel set out in foot along the railroad line toward the Soviet border. Another of my father's children now had a chance of escaping the Nazis. Later, we would get word from Rivka and Herschel did indeed make it to the neutral zone, where they joined thousands of others who hoped to escape the country. Within a day, they were allowed to cross over. Once in the Soviet Union, they would eventually reunite with my brother, who was staying in Moscow at the home of my uncle, who escaped to Russia during the First World War. Shortly after they settled in, however, the Soviet government requested that all Jewish men become citizens so they could join the Red Army. This created anxiety for Abe and Herschel. The Polish army was well known for its anti-Semitism and related abuse. Presuming the Red Army to be no different, the three fled to Siberia, where they hid until the end of the war. But then, let's just get back to what happens with when the German occupation of Grochek was complete. Their living conditions declined considerably. Our Polish neighbors had grown wary of associating with us in any way. Food was more scarce than ever. My father, who had continued on as a forced laborer, grew prematurely frail and ill. Beating of Jews in our community had become frequent and ever more public, a warning to all of us. Orthodox Jews, especially those who wore the traditional beards and religious garments, were especially at risk of being targeted. Pogroms regularly erupted in the square, during which soldiers and Poles beat Jews bloody just for the sport. Reading this is the best that we could do, and I really wanted to get into this because I really hope that you will buy the book. It's very easy to read, and it's very important because there's a lot of good that happens after we get through some of this misery. Continuing to read From Misery to Happiness, The Life of a Holocaust Survivor by George Freshman. Let me read this, and after I read this, then I'll get into something that's really very, very sweet and nice. For a time, I was lucky to be working for a Nazi officer who treated me reasonably well. Sometimes he would take me out of the camp to nearby farms to clean, fix clocks, and perform other kinds of general handiwork. On occasion, one of the farmers would give me a couple of pieces of bread. Typically, I would eat one piece and bring the other to Joe, who was starving back at the camp. Once I saved the second piece for myself, hiding it under my pillow to be eaten the following day. When I woke up the next morning, it was gone, stolen by another desperate prisoner right out from under my head. One day, this same Nazi officer approached me, I presumed for another job outside the camp, but his demeanor had changed. He stared down at me, his jaw set with tension. I was immediately gripped by fear and my head spun with question. What have I done? Doesn't he remember who I am? How I helped him? But of course it wasn't my place to ask anything of him. He ordered me to lean over a bench, preparing to lash me with his whip. My fear bloomed into anger. I straightened and faced him, tearing open my shirt. "Why don't you just shoot me instead?" The officer stared down at me, his expression cold. He drew a piece of bread from his coat pocket and handed it to me. "Go away," he said, waving me off. I shuffled back into the barracks, burning with frustration. I could not comprehend how one human being could treat another so badly. To this day, I don't know for sure the exact reason for the officer's sudden about-face. Maybe he was drunk or otherwise confused. Perhaps he didn't recognize me. Looking back, I wonder if he had merely been using me for his own convenience, and once I'd done all I could for him, he'd make a point of putting me in my place. The Nazis looked for any opportunity to remind us that we were not equal to them, that we shouldn't get any wrong ideas about our place in the camp or our importance to those running it. Work makes you fear. I jumped down from the train along with other prisoners and gazed up at the sign above the entrance to Auschwitz. My eyes drifted to several tall, rectangular chimneys standing in the distance, spewing smoke and flames and emitting a ghastly odor I would later learn was literally the smell of death, the burning bodies of those who had perished at the camp for one reason or another, be it starvation, disease, or execution. I'm not going to read any more about this. Now, there's a lot of this in the book, but I'm going to move to, because we're going to run out of time, but I will have another show that we're going to do with George Freshman the same way, but let me just tell you that there was a happy time. When of course the Americans came and they were freed, and then that's the thing. Now what do? It's called liberation. This is it's so beautiful, but we'll get started and then we're going to have to end, but then the next time we do the show, I'll read all the positive parts. This is called Chapter 6, Liberation. The will to survive is a tenacious thing, and with good reason, I suppose. A fresh round of rumors rippled through the camp in early spring, this time accompanied by the sound of bombing that seemed to grow closer each day, said that the Soviets were now fighting the Germans and that the Allies were conquering all the major German cities. The Americans are moving towards Munich, someone had said. Even the most pessimistic among us could not help but feel lifted by such a statement. Dachau was just 10 miles north of Munich. And I'm going to stop here and just tell you, of course, a lot of you know that my husband Bill was a B-17 pilot, and he flew a lot of missions, actually 35 missions, from England over to Germany. And when I think of what a wonderful thing he did to help these people. Well, George, we'll be back with you another time, but your book's wonderful. Go to Amazon.com. It's From Misery to Happiness, The Life of a Holocaust Survivor, George Freshman.